So other types of evolution. This is when two species evolve after a long time and have to live together. What do we call that? I'll give you one letter. Good job. Coevolution, right? Because I said I'm starting on that slide. And it's, what do we know about this relationship? Because you already learned. What type of relationship is a hummingbird or a bee with a flower? Mutualism. Good job. Associated with mutualism and predation. This picture has nothing to do with predation, but when you have coevolution, oftentimes predators rely on their prey, so they live closely together with them, or they need to be near them in order to survive. So we're talking about organisms that rely on other organisms, and that's what coevolution is. Another form of evolution is called convergent evolution. And this graph here, you have to be able to recognize that that graph is representing convergent evolution, because sometimes they put the graph instead of the actual relationship or examples of what the definition is. But what do you think is happening in convergent? These organisms underwent convergent evolution, and so did these. They're different organisms, okay? But what do you see that you could reference that might describe convergent? That's it. They have similar features, even though they come from, and I wouldn't just say two, I would say from differing ancestries, okay? Because we're kind of looking at two to one feature, because you're looking at the graph and you're thinking of convergent and you're thinking like two comes to one. So you have two different species that had different features, but they've developed a similar feature over time based on environmental conditions and their need to survive. So for example, wings, right? Of bats and historical birds and birds of today, all similar.
The environment required bats to have a specific wing for survival, and that's why they have a similar feature to birds who require the same type of survival.
Divergent. So divergent, we have 1 to 2, which makes sense when you think of diverge, because they're, going out. So what's happening, and this is one that it's a lot easier to understand, where you have some common ancestor, right? And then what happens? Then they develop differences, which can eventually lead to speciation, right? Because they're so unique. And I always think of dogs. That's why I put them there, because for me, we all know this is their common ancestor, the wolf. Somebody must have taken a wolf home, right? Had him in his house, tamed him, domesticated it. Then you end up with all these different, I don't know how this happened, but eventually this is what happens, right? Well, breeding led to specific characteristics of traits in dogs that people favor, let's say, based on, size, cuddly, fluffy, kind, smart, all those things matter. All right, parallel evolution, which this is something you're going to pretty much experience when you do your projects on biomes, because geographically in the world, based on environmental conditions, organisms will develop traits, and it doesn't matter where in the world you are. If the environmental conditions are similar in different parts of the world, the evolution of species will be similar. And like, for example, I'm going to go broad here, but let's say deserts, or a part of a desert, anywhere in the world, they're going to have similar organisms. Same thing with, well, that's what this is trying to explain in parallel evolution. So you have a parent species distinct from the other one from a completely different location, but over time, the development of the new species happens similar in both areas. We didn't do this yesterday, but I already recorded this. So we're talking about human evolution, or human evolution of resistance. And you mentioned a story about a person getting bit by a snake. A snake handler who purposely injects himself with poison to develop immunities. But it's only evolution if that person gives birth and another birth and another birth and another birth, and before you know it, you have a group of individuals born resistant to snake venom. then that's evolution. Because remember, it has to be evolution of a population. A change within a species is the first step, right? But the process, okay. The perfect example of evolution of resistance, or evolution in general, we're witnessing it today, is evolution of pests and bacteria. The fact that we require pesticides in order to protect the crops, and pests are becoming immune to the pesticide, and over time, new pesticides have to be used and more, and this is called a financial treadmill. You don't have to write that word down, that's later. But farmers are literally suffering because of this evolution of resistance that the pests have. And why? Because if you spray a pesticide, same thing, did we talk about lice in this class? And the treatment of lice. And if you don't treat lice correctly, you give a chance for the lice to reproduce, and you subjected them to the chemical, but he reproduced. Now he has offspring that have been subjected to the chemical, and before you know it, there's a new whole thing of lice that are immune to the lice treatment. God, that ever happens. Same thing happens with antibiotics. If you don't take your antibiotics correctly, I know you probably all have done this. It says take it for 10 days, and you're like, after 3 days, oh, I'm good, I'm not going to take them anymore. You just gave the bacteria an opportunity to reproduce with that chemical and a chance to develop a new strain, which you know this exists, okay? And then antibiotics stop working. How many of you have had to take antibiotics and then 3 days later you got sick again and your doctor sent you a whole different prescription? Yeah, that's what's happening, okay? So that's evolution of today. What I wanted to say in the video is don't describe ever the use of medicine that we are evolving. Medicine that we take is to fight a pathogen in your body, and they're the ones that evolve to the exposure to the medicine. We can probably show some evolutionary traits, but if you're going to describe medicine, antibiotics, vaccines, antiviral drugs, you're talking about the pathogen, okay? So don't get confused on the test. Go back. There's two other things. These are before pesticide, after pesticide, because this is a diagram of what's happening and survival. And I have a great video to show you, but I'll show it to you later. All right, last evolution is evolution of ecosystems. It's called ecological secession, and it's a gradual change within an ecosystem over time. So same thing of evolution, and I'm only showing you plants here and trees, but within here, there's going to be other forms of life and the change of other forms of life. How many of you live in a land that's like 2 acres? Anybody? 1 acre.
My house.
Okay, anybody know of a friend that has 2 acres? What's in the backpack of the 2 acres? Trees, almost like a forest, because they never get to it. They have 2 acres, but they don't really use the second acre. If they stopped using another part of land eventually, or if you have a neighbor that left or abandoned their house and you watch the change over time, it goes from grass to weeds to shrubs to a tree to a forest. This happened in my block. And in that forest is wildlife that you have to get rid of if you want to live there again, right? So there's 2 forms. Primary secession, lifeless habitat. Very rare, people. Very rare in today's world. Very rare. Because a lifeless habitat means there's no soil anywhere. I'm not talking about on your sidewalk and you're like, oh, there's no soil there, so secession can occur. Under the sidewalk, there's soil. What happens in between the cracks of the sidewalk? Weeds are growing because they're down there. They want to come out, right? But where there is no soil, all you have is rock, exposed rock, and you're going to have what's called primary species, lichens and mosses, or lichens and mosses if you want to call them that. They're also known as pioneer species. You might want to write that word down in case you see it, you recognize it. They're going to break down rock and form soil.
Why are they called pioneer species?
Because they're the first. And they form soil, which leads to life. Because if you grab a thing of soil, inside is bacteria, insects, right? There's also necessary components for life like water and nutrients. So life can thrive in soil. And from there you got weeds, shrubs, and then you got trees. And the order of trees is usually from pine to oak. You should know that. So you know oak is the last, it's the strongest of trees, so it's going to be the last stage of secession. And the next picture shows that. Secondary secession, soil exists or life exists and the progression is the same.